Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 3, Demobilisation. All the world over, nursing their scars, sit the old fighting men broke in the wars. All the world over, surely and grim, mocking the lilt of the conqueror's hymn. By Rudyard Kipling. The new administration was formed on the morrow of the election results. I had obtained a promise beforehand from the Prime Minister that he would restore the old system of cabinet government at the earliest moment possible. This was not immediately achieved. The 5 members of the War Cabinet, who were alone responsible for all policy and to whose direction the Secretaries of State and other ministers were in theory amenable, appeared reluctant to distribute their powers around a wider circle. It was indeed nearly a year before the normal constitutional practice was resumed. The principle was, however, conceded from the outset. The Prime Minister reconstructed his government with masterful dispatch. At the end of a conversation on various topics, he said to me in so many words, "Make up your mind whether you would like to go to the War Office or the Admiralty, and let me know by tomorrow. You can take the air with you in either case. I am not going to keep it as a separate department." I spent the night at Blenheim, and from there accepted the Admiralty together with the Air Ministry. But when I reached London the next afternoon, I found the position had changed. The temper of the army and the problem of demobilisation caused increasing anxiety. I could not refuse the Prime Minister's wish that I should go to the War Office. The new ministry was announced on January 10, and I quitted the Ministry of Munitions and became responsible for the War Office on the 15th. I was immediately confronted with conditions of critical emergency. In the summer of 1917, a draft scheme of demobilisation had been prepared partly in the War Office, but mainly in accordance with civilian opinion. The prime object was naturally the restarting of industry, and questions of the feelings and discipline of the troops themselves were not accorded proper weight. In June 1917, the scheme had been referred to General Headquarters, and it was immediately criticized by Sir Douglas Haig as most objectionable and prejudicial to discipline. The views of the civil departments were, however, generally sustained by the War Cabinet. The scheme lay in the background during the prolonged crisis of the war, and at the armistice suddenly became vigorously operative. According to the logic of this scheme, the first men to be released were what we called key men, that is, men who were asked for by employers at home to restart the industries. These key men were therefore being picked out by scores of thousands from all the units of the army and hurried back across the Channel. But these key men, who were to be the first to come home, had been in many cases the last to go out. The important parts they played in war industry had retained them at home until the needs of the army became desperate after March 21, 1918. In practice also the system lent itself to inevitable abuse. Those who were so fortunate as to be able to present letters and telegrams from employers at home, offering them employment and claiming their services, were immediately released. Influence was not slow to procure such credentials. Several thousands, while on leave at home, were actually excused from returning to the army. The ordinary soldier without these advantages saw this lately joined comrade hurrying home to take his job, or somebody's job, in England, while he, after years of perils and privations on a soldier's pay, wounded and sent back to the carnage 3 or sometimes 4 times, was to be left until all the plums at home had been picked up and every vacancy filled. The fighting man has a grim sense of justice, which it is dangerous to affront. As the result, the discipline of every single separate unit throughout the whole of our army in all the theaters of war was swiftly and simultaneously rotted and undermined. For nearly 2 months this process had continued, and it had become intolerable to the fighting troops. The study I gave to the matter in the 5 days which intervened between the acceptance and the assumption of my new office left me in no doubt upon the course to pursue. Mutinies and disorders had already taken place on both sides of the Channel. In particular, a mutiny had occurred at Folkestone on January 3. Sir Eric Geddes had newly succeeded General Smuts in dealing with the restarting of industry. A few days before I entered the War Office, the approaches to the building were blocked by lorry loads of insubordinate Army Service Corps men who had seized the vehicles and driven them up to London. On each lorry was painted the legend borrowed from a Daily Express cartoon, "Get on or get out Geddes." A wave of intense impatience and resentment, accompanied by serious breaches of discipline, spread across the splendid armies which had never faltered in the direst stress of war. If the cause was plain, so was the remedy. My only difficulty was to procure the assent of others, my only apprehension whether we were not already too late. I had before taking up my new duties insisted that the Secretary of State for War should have the final word against all civilian departments in matters affecting the discipline of the troops. In the situation which had now developed, this could hardly be denied, and was readily conceded. I propounded forthwith the following policy. First, soldiers should, as a general rule, only be released from the front in accordance with their length of service and age. Those who had served the longest at the front were to be the first to be demobilized, and any man with 3 wound stripes or more was to be discharged forthwith. Everyone must take his turn in accordance with this order. Secondly, the pay of the army must be immediately increased to more than double the war rate, in order to lessen the gap between the rewards of military and civilian employment. Thirdly, in order, whilst still maintaining the necessary forces in the field, to release the men who had fought in as large numbers and as quickly as possible, the 80,000 young lads who had been trained but had not quitted our shores must be retained compulsorily for a period of 2 years and sent abroad. Ardently supported by Sir Douglas Haig, whom I summoned from France, and amid the continued and growing demoralization of the army, I obtained the necessary authority from the War Cabinet. But this took some time. The Prime Minister was in France. Mr. Bonar-Law, though exercising a wide measure of discretion, referred important matters to him. The War Cabinet were perturbed at the idea of presenting a new conscription bill to Parliament after the war was over, and after the electorate had shown such vehement repugnance to the idea. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was rightly concerned at the expenditure involved in the heavy cost of the increased pay to the services. There was no time for ceremony. After consultation with the Adjutant General, Sir George Macdonough, an officer of brilliant attainments, I decided to take him over to Paris with me on the evening of January 23 to obtain the Prime Minister's approval to the scheme which had been proposed. We breakfasted with Mr. Lloyd George on the morning of the 24th, accompanied him to the peace conference at the Quai d'Orsay, returned with him to lunch and discussed the whole position. I instructed the Adjutant General to draw up 2 army orders embodying the decisions which had been obtained from the Prime Minister, and to submit them to me at 6 p.m. Having approved these orders, I directed the Adjutant General to return to London by the midnight train and to get the army orders issued, with such departmental additions and Army Council instructions as might be needed with the least possible delay. This he did, and on January 29, Army Order 54, extra remuneration to those retained on military service, and Army Order 55, Armies of Occupation, were issued. The title of the first of these army orders explains itself. The second announced the government's intention about the maintenance of armies of occupation pending the reconstruction of the regular forces, and laid down the rules under which officers and other ranks would be retained or demobilized. Corresponding royal warrants were issued concurrently. I wrote an explanation for the armies of the whole position in language which they would understand, and it was published officially at the same time as the army orders. It covered the whole field of War Office policy in relation to the troops during the year 1919. It was strictly and unchangingly carried into effect. The armies of occupation. Explanatory note by the Secretary of State for War. First, on November 11, when the armistice was signed, there were about 3,500,000 Imperial British officers and soldiers on the pay and ration strength of the British Army. During the 2 months that have passed since then, rather more than 750,000 have been demobilized or discharged. The system of demobilization which has been adopted aims at reviving national industry by bringing the men home in the order of urgency according to trades. There is no doubt that this is the wisest course, and it will continue to be followed in the large majority of cases. The time has now come, however, when military needs must be considered as well as industrial needs. Second, unless we are to be defrauded of the fruits of victory and, without considering our allies, to throw away all that we have won with so much cost and trouble, we must provide for a good many months to come armies of occupation for the enemy's territory. These armies must be strong enough to exact from the Germans, Turks, and others the just terms which the Allies demand, and we must bear our share with France, America, and Italy in providing them. The better trained and disciplined these armies are, the fewer men will be needed to do the job. We have therefore to create, in order to wind up the war satisfactorily, a strong, compact, contented, well-disciplined army which will maintain the high reputation of the British service and make sure we are not tricked of what we have rightfully won. It will be an army far smaller than our present army. In fact, it will be about 1/4 of the great armies we have been using in the war. Third, our military commanders, who know what Marshal Foch's wishes are, say that in their opinion not more than 900,000 men of all ranks and arms will be sufficient to guard our interests in this transition period. Therefore, when this new army has been organized, and while it is being organized, over 2.5 million men, who were held to military service when the fighting stopped, will be released to their homes and to industry as fast as the trains and ships can carry them and the pay offices settle their accounts. In other words, out of 3,500,000, it is proposed to keep for the present about 900,000 and release all the others as fast as possible. Fourth, how ought we to choose the 900,000 who are to remain to finish up the work? When men are marked for release, they obviously ought to go home in the order which will most quickly restart our industries, for otherwise they would leave their means of livelihood in the army and relinquish their rations and their separation allowance only to become unemployed in great numbers. But when men are kept back in the service to form the armies of occupation, a choice cannot be made simply on trade grounds. It must be made on grounds which appeal broadly to a sense of justice and fair play. Length of service, age, and wounds must be the main considerations entitling a man to release. The new army will therefore be composed in the first instance only from those who did not enlist before January 1, 1916, who are not over 37 years of age, and have not more than 2 wound stripes. If anyone has to stay, it must be those who are not the oldest, not those who came the earliest, not those who have suffered the most. Fifth, we therefore take these broad rules as our main guide. According to the best calculations which are possible, they should give us about 1,300,000 men, out of which it is intended to form the army of 900,000. If we find, as we shall do in all probability, that we have in the classes chosen more men than we actually require, after dealing with a certain number of pivotal and compassionate cases, we shall proceed to reduce down to the figure of 900,000, first by reducing the age of retention to 36 to 35, next releasing the men with 2 wound stripes, and then on to 34. As the time goes on, we shall not require to keep so large an army as 900,000 in the field, and it will be possible to continue making reductions on the principle of releasing the oldest men by the years of their age. When, however, the results of the war are finally achieved, the divisions which have remained to the end will be brought home as units and make their entry into the principal cities of Great Britain with which they are territorially associated. Volunteers for 1 year's service at a time for the armies of occupation will be accepted from men who would otherwise be entitled to release if they are physically fit and otherwise suitable, and young soldiers now serving will be sent from home to take their turn and do their share. All these will be in relief of the older men. They will enable the age limit to be further reduced and the older men to be sent home. In particular, the 69 battalions of young soldiers of 18 years of age and upwards, who are now at home, will be sent at once to help guard the Rhine bridgeheads. They will thus enable an equal number of men, old enough to be their fathers, to come home, and they themselves will have a chance to see the German provinces which are now in our keeping and the battlefields where the British Army won immortal fame. Sixth, the new armies of occupation will begin forming from February 1, and it is hoped that in 3 months they may be completely organized. There will then be 2 classes of men in khaki. That is, those who form the armies of occupation and those who are to be demobilized. Everything possible will be done to send home or disperse the 2.5 million men who are no longer required, but they must wait their turn patiently and meanwhile do their duty in an exemplary manner. Any of these men who are marked for home, who are guilty of any form of insubordination, will, apart from any other punishment, be put back to the bottom of the list. There are no means of getting these great numbers of men home quickly unless everyone does his duty in the strictest possible way. It is recognized, however, that service in the armies of occupation is an extra demand which the state makes in its need upon certain classes of citizens. The emoluments of the armies of occupation will therefore be substantially augmented, and every man will draw bonuses from the date of his posting to these armies, with arrears from February 1. Ninth, the armies of occupation will be as follows: Home Army, Army of the Rhine, Army of the Middle East, Detachment of the Far North, Garrisons of the Crown Colonies and India. 12th. The above arrangements seem to be the best that can be devised for the year 1919. During this year, however, we must remake the old British regular army so as to provide, on a voluntary basis, the overseas garrisons of India, Egypt, the Mediterranean fortresses, and other foreign stations. It is believed that volunteering for the regular army will improve as soon as the great mass of those who volunteered for the war against Germany in the early days have come back to the freedom of civil life and have had a chance to look round. It is upon the steady rebuilding of this army that the relief of the territorial battalions in India and various detachments in distant theaters now depends. Every effort will therefore be made to hasten its formation, both by recruiting and by re-engagement. 13th. It is not necessary at this stage to settle the conditions on which the National Home Defense Army, for after the war, will be formed. There are many more urgent problems which should be solved first. 14th. The entire scheme of the War Office for dealing with the many difficulties of the present situation and for safeguarding British interests is thus published to the Army and the nation at large. It has been agreed upon between all the authorities and departments concerned. The consent of Parliament, where necessary, will be asked for at the earliest possible moment. It remains for all ranks and all classes to work together with the utmost comradeship and energy to put it into force, and thereby to safeguard the best interests of each one of us and the final victory of our cause. But the time to prepare and decide upon these far-reaching measures and to procure the assent or submission of so many important personages, namely 14 days, and the further time needed for the armies to realize the new decisions, was a very anxious period, marked by many ugly and dangerous episodes. Not only the armies but the peoples were profoundly affected by the sudden cessation of the war. The poise and balance even of Britain was deranged. In those days the Russian Revolution had not been exposed as a mere organization of tyranny, perverse and infinitely cruel. The events which had taken place in Russia, the doctrines and watchwords which poured out from Moscow, seemed to millions of people in every land to offer prospects of moving forward into a bright new world of brotherhood, equality and science. Everywhere the subversive elements were active, and everywhere they found a response. So many frightful things had happened, and such tremendous collapses of established structures had been witnessed. The nations had suffered so long that a tremor and indeed a spasm shook the foundations of every state. Here in Britain we know our own people well. Millions of men and women have been accustomed for generations to take an active part in politics, and have felt that in their sphere and station they were constantly deciding and guiding the policy of their country. The political parties, with all their organizations, associations, leagues and clubs, afforded effective vehicles of popular expression. Moreover, the Constitution had itself grown up as the most thorough and practical mechanism yet devised in the modern world for bringing the force of public opinion to bear upon the conduct of affairs. Well was it that we were broad-based upon the people's will, and newly authorized by their direct pronouncement. Certainly there were factors which nobody could measure and which no one had ever before seen at work. Armies of nearly 4 million men had been suddenly and consciously released from the iron discipline of war, from the inexorable compulsions of what they believed to be a righteous cause. All these vast numbers had been taught for years how to kill, how to punch a bayonet into the vital organs, how to smash the brains out with a mace, how to make and throw bombs as if they were no more than snowballs. All of them had been through a mill of prolonged, inconceivable pressures and innumerable tearing teeth. To all, sudden and violent death, the woeful spectacle of shattered men and dwellings was, either to see in others or expect and face for oneself, the commonest incident of daily life. If these armies formed a united resolve, if they were seduced from the standards of duty and patriotism, There was no power which could even have attempted to withstand them. This was the testing time, if there ever was one, for the renowned sagacity and political education of the British democracy. In a single week, more than 30 cases of insubordination among the troops were reported from different centers. Nearly all were repressed or appeased by the remonstrances of their officers. But in several cases, considerable bodies of men were for some days entirely out of control. The chief offenders were the Army Service Corps in the Grove Park and Campden Park mechanical transport depots. Some units informed their officers that they had constituted themselves a soldiers' council and intended to march to the nearest township and fraternize with the workmen. Usually they were dissuaded by reasonable arguments. Sometimes the officers, cycling by a circuitous route, intercepted their men before the town was reached and induced them to return to their duty. The influence of the regimental officers was nearly always successful. Although the situation was very threatening in many places, almost the only spot where there was actual and serious rioting was at Luton, where, owing to the weakness of the civic authorities, the town hall was burnt by the mob. A regular mutiny broke out at Calais. Between the 27th and the 31st of January, the army ordnance detachments and the mechanical transport, which were the least disciplined part of the army, had seen least of the fighting and were most closely associated with political trade unionism, refused to obey orders. They met the leave boats and induced a large number of the returning soldiers to join them. In 24 hours, the ringleaders were at the head of about 3,000 or 4,000 armed men and in complete possession of the town. All the fighting divisions had moved on towards or into Germany, and there was no force immediately at hand to cope with the mutineers. The commander-in-chief accordingly recalled 2 divisions from their forward march, and placing them under the personal control of a most trusted and respected army commander, General Byng, directed them upon the scene of the disorders. The soldiers of these divisions were roused to indignation at the news that demobilization was being obstructed by comrades of theirs who had in no wise borne the brunt of the fighting. By nightfall of the second day, the disaffected soldiery were encircled by a ring of bayonets and machine guns. At daylight, a converging advance was made upon them. In front, officers, unarmed, called upon them to return to duty. Behind them, deadly overwhelming force was arrayed. Thus confronted, most of the men drifted to the rear, but several hundreds stood their ground with obstinacy. A shocking explosion would have been precipitated by a single shot, but self-restraint and good feeling triumphed. The ringleaders were arrested, and the rest returned to their obedience without the shedding of a drop of blood. Simultaneously with this came the news of serious riots in Glasgow and Belfast. Both these riots were fomented by the Communists. The army was called upon to aid the civil power. 2 brigades were moved into Glasgow. These were only second-line troops, consisting of the least efficient soldiers or young recruits. They had not, like those at the front, been tempered in war, nor had they tasted victory. However, officers and men discharged their duty faultlessly. Order was restored, very few lives were lost, and when blood flowed, it was mostly from the nose. The last incident that I shall record came under my personal notice. At 8:30 on the morning of February 8, I was summoned urgently to the War Office. As I drove thither, I observed a battalion of guards drawn up along the Mall. I passed through the Admiralty Arch and reached my office without remarking anything else unusual. Arrived there, I received a disagreeable report. About 3,000 soldiers of many units and all arms of the service had gathered at Victoria Station to catch the early train for those returning from leave. The director of movements had failed to make adequate arrangements for the transport, feeding, and housing of leave men coming, in this case, principally from the north. The poor soldiers, many of whom had waited all night on the platform, none of whom could obtain food or tea, felt it very hard to be going back to France now that the fighting was over and the war was won, while so many of their comrades were, as they had been told, snapping up the best billets in England. They had suddenly, upon some instigation, resorted in a body to Whitehall, and were now filling the Horse Guards parade, armed and in a state of complete disorder. Their leader, I was informed, was at that very moment prescribing conditions to the staff of the London command in the Horse Guards building. Sir William Robertson and General Fielding, commanding the London district, presented themselves to me with this account, and added that a reserve battalion of grenadiers and 2 troops of the household cavalry were available on the spot. What course were they authorized to adopt? I asked whether the battalion would obey orders, and was answered, "The officers believe so." On this I requested the generals to surround and make prisoners of the disorderly mass. They departed immediately on this duty. I remained in my room, a prey to anxiety. A very grave issue had arisen at the physical heart of the state. 10 minutes passed slowly. From my windows I could see the Life Guards on duty in Whitehall closing the gates and doors of the archway. Then suddenly there appeared on the roof of the Horse Guards a number of civilians, perhaps 20 or 30 in all, who spread themselves out in a long black silhouette and were evidently watching something which was taking place, or about to take place, on the parade ground below them. What this might be I had no means of knowing, although I was but 100 yards away. Another 10 minutes of tension passed, and back came the generals in a much more cheerful mood. Everything had gone off happily. The grenadiers, with fixed bayonets, had closed in upon the armed crowd. The household cavalry had executed an enveloping movement on the other flank, and the whole 3,000 men had been shepherded and escorted under arrest to Wellington Barracks, where they were all going to have breakfast before resuming their journey to France. No one was hurt. Very few were called to account, and only 1 or 2 were punished, and that not seriously. A large portion of the blame lay upon the administration, which had made no change in its routine at the railway stations since the fighting had stopped. For years men had gone back punctually and faithfully to danger and death, with hardly any officer or organization, just as if they were ordinary passengers on an excursion train. And those responsible had not realized that much more careful arrangements were required in the mild reign of peace. The result of the new policy and of its explanation to the troops was almost instantaneous. A very few days sufficed to set back the evil currents which had begun to flow. The unfair trial to which our army had been subjected was at an end. A system of demobilization had now been instituted, the justice of which carried conviction to the soldier's mind. The principle that length of service, age, and wounds counted before every other consideration and every form of influence commanded the immediate assent of all ranks. The increases of pay were accepted in a friendly spirit. As for the 80,000 lads of 18, they were eager to see the Rhine and set their fathers, uncles, and elder brothers free after all the hardships these had gone through. The king reviewed a dozen of these fine young battalions in Hyde Park before their departure, and everyone was struck with their alert and confident bearing. Within a fortnight of the new proclamation, the discipline of our immense, though melting armies all over the world had regained its traditional standards. The new House of Commons met for the first time upon the heels of these events. It asked literally several thousand questions about the details of demobilization, and special machinery had to be set up to cope with this unparalleled curiosity. But the conscription bill was passed by a very large majority. The Liberal and Labour oppositions, animated by a sense of detachment from responsibility, fought it tooth and nail. It was lucky they were so few, for the essential services of the state might have been greatly obstructed at a critical time. Meanwhile, the demobilization of the armies proceeded on the greatest scale. For a period of nearly 6 months, we maintained an average rate of 10,000 men a day, discharged to civil life. This immense body, equal to a whole peacetime division, was collected daily from all the theaters of war, disembarked, detrained, disarmed, dekitted, demobilized, paid off, and discharged between sunrise and sunset. I regard this as an enormous feat of British organizing capacity. The armies had grown up gradually. Men had enlisted as individuals. They were dispersed in great masses, and somehow or other, at the outset, they nearly all found homes and employment. The history books boast of the way in which 20 or 30,000 of Cromwell's Ironsides laid down the panoply of war and resorted to peaceful occupations. But what was this compared with the noble behavior of nearly 4 million British soldiers who, without confusion or commotion of any kind, once they were treated as they deserved, merged themselves unostentatiously in the mass of the nation and gathered together again the severed threads of their former lives? One had expected, after all the methodically inculcated butchery and barbarism of 5 years of war, that acts of murder and pillage, brutality and rapine, would for some years at any rate be rife in the land. On the contrary, such are the powers of civilization and education, and such are the qualities of our people, that crimes of violence actually diminished, and prisons had to be closed and sold, when 4 million trained and successful killers, or nearly 1/3 of the whole manhood of the nation, resumed their civic status. Meanwhile, having halted for a week to allow the enemy to retreat, the armies of the Allies had advanced into Germany by easy marches. All the roads from France and Belgium, which in 1914 had carried the invaders, were now filled with endless columns marching in the reverse direction. The British troops were so good-humoredly received by the enemy population and got on so well with them that stringent and reiterated orders against fraternization were required. By the end of November, the heads of Sir Douglas Haig's columns had reached the Rhine, and a few days later the occupation of the bridgehead at Cologne was completed. In all, almost 250,000 men representing the British Empire actually entered Germany and settled down in pleasant quarters and rest camps where their natural friendliness and good conduct speedily reassured the inhabitants. But a hard story has here to be told. The armistice conditions had prescribed that the blockade of Germany was to continue. At the request of the Germans, a clause had been added that the Allies and the United States contemplate the provisioning of Germany to such an extent as shall be found necessary. Nothing was done in pursuance of this until the second renewal of the armistice on January 16, 1919. In fact, the blockade of Germany was extended to the Baltic ports and was thus made more severe than before. The food situation in Germany became grave, and painful stories circulated of the hardship of mothers and children. During these months, very few people in Germany, except profiteers and farmers, had enough to eat. Even as late as May, members of the German delegation at Versailles were suffering from the after-effects of want of proper food. There was in France and, to some extent in England, a deliberate refusal to face the facts. In January 1919 began a prolonged series of negotiations upon the conditions under which food might be imported into Germany. Public opinion in the Allied countries was callous. Their leaders were overwhelmed with business. A possible charge of pro-Germanism intimidated politicians. The officials into whose hands the arrangements fell thought they were doing their duty by haggling and stippling. Equally bad food conditions existed in other defeated states, for which partial provision was being made. There was also a general shortage of food and shipping throughout the world. But meanwhile the Germans underwent a period of extreme stringency equal to that of a besieged town. It is remarkable that the sudden punch which destroyed this hateful deadlock originated with the British Army on the Rhine. In February, the reports of military officers, which reached the War Office of the food conditions in the occupied areas, became increasingly disquieting. A note of anger began to mingle in the dry official chronicles. I made deliberately a rough exposure to the House of Commons on March 3. We are enforcing the blockade with rigor, and Germany is very near starvation. All the evidence I have received from officers sent by the War Office all over Germany show, first, the great privations which the German people are suffering, and secondly, the danger of a collapse of the entire structure of German social and national life under the stress of hunger and malnutrition. Early in March, the food negotiations at Spa appeared about to break down in glacial rigmarole. But Lord Plumer, who commanded the British Army of Occupation in Germany, sent a telegram to the War Office, forwarded to the Supreme Council, urging that food should be supplied to the suffering population in order to prevent the spread of disorder as well as on humanitarian grounds. He emphasized the bad effect produced upon the British Army by the spectacle of suffering which surrounded them. From him and through other channels we learned that the British soldiers would certainly share their rations with the women and children among whom they were living, and that the physical efficiency of the troops was already being affected. Armed with Lord Plumer's dispatch and these details, Mr. Lloyd George took the Supreme Council by the throat. "No one," he remarked, "can say that General Plumer is pro-German." The officials were chidden, and the negotiations resumed. The difficulties and disorganization of the world were however so great that it was not until May that substantial importations of food into Germany actually took place. The blockade, though according to the peace treaty in force until its ratification, disappeared altogether by the middle of July. But a great opportunity had been lost. The German people on November 11 had not only been defeated in the field, they had been vanquished by world opinion. These bitter experiences stripped their conquerors, in their eyes, of all credentials except those of force. A remaining task at the War Office was to get rid of the 250,000 German prisoners of war in British hands. For this we had to wait for many months. The French found it very difficult to release them. When they thought of all the slaughter represented by their capture and of the depleted manhood of France, they could not bring themselves to let these hundreds of thousands of unlucky men go home. It was like surrendering captured cannon. By the end of the summer the battlefields had all been cleared. Every toil appointed to the prisoners had been performed. There was no longer excuse or reason for their retention. Yet, as Pharaoh found it of old, it was hard to let the people go. I determined to break this complex by direct action. The telegrams tell the tale. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Balfour, August 21, 1919. After discussing the situation about German prisoners with General Esser, I am convinced that their repatriation should begin immediately. Their work is done. They are costing us more than £30,000 a day. A fine opportunity of repatriating them is afforded by using the return trains which are bringing back the British divisions from the Rhine to French ports. In addition, they can proceed by march. I have therefore given directions to prepare plans for both these methods. The operation will begin at the earliest possible moment and at latest by September 1. May I urgently appeal to you to set the machinery in motion at your end which will ensure the reception of these prisoners in Germany. 80% of them belong to unoccupied Germany or our own area, and less than 20% to territories under Allied control. I propose to begin with the German repatriations. Every day counts, as every day trains are arriving with Rhine soldiers and going back empty. Mr. Churchill to Sir Henry Wilson. Please see my telegram about the German prisoners and do your utmost to facilitate immediate action. The whole economy of this army depends upon it. We should not hesitate to act independently of the French. Will you communicate direct with Esser, advising him when he may begin? He could fill every train returning to the Rhine from tomorrow onwards. 10,000 at Audric, for example, could start at once. I am counting upon sanction being given within the next 2 or 3 days. All went well. The French delayed no longer, and the process of repatriating the immense numbers of German soldiers who were eating their hearts out in captivity, once begun, continued without ceasing until one more miserable relic of the war had passed out of daily life.